This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Morgan. I'm an editor at Ahval News, and this is Turkey Abroad. Joining me today is Dr. Sarah Glynn. She is an independent writer, researcher, and activist, and she's joining me from Strasbourg, France. Sarah, welcome to Turkey Abroad.
Thank you for having me.
So I invited you for this podcast because I came across an article you wrote on open democracy from July 2nd that was titled, "Turkey's Invasion of Northern Iraq Could Lead to Civil War." And, when we hear civil war in that kind of context, it brings back memories of the post-1991 civil war, of course, in Iraq between different Kurdish groups, and Turkey, of course, was involved in that too. But before we go into some of the other kind of regional and international dynamics, geopolitical dynamics to this kind of conflict, can you sum up why you argue Turkey risks sparking a new civil war in the first place?
Well, I think it's not a risk, it's something that they would very much be delighted to have happen, because they would be the only beneficiaries of it. I mean, although we hardly hear about what's happening there, it is basically an invasion and an occupation that Turkey is carrying out in South Kurdistan, North Iraq. And they are very close, of course, to the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which dominates the Kurdistan Regional Government. And the Kurdistan Democratic Party is supporting what they're doing, but no other parties or organizations there are. The people on the ground that are fighting back are the PKK forces. And the KDP would be very happy to see the PKK driven out, but actually what would be happening would be basically Turkey taking over yet more land. I mean, it's a very, very aggressive government, and I mean, it's very worrying. And I mean, at the moment, the KDP forces, the KDP peshmerga are involved, but in a sort of not absolutely directly. So it's a mixture, I think, of providing information, and they'll basically sort of entrap the PKK forces, try and circle them, but and just make it easier for the Turkish forces, but really trying to avoid direct interaction. Obviously, it's very, very difficult for the PKK to defend in that situation, because if they defend against the KDP, then they will be accused of fighting against brother Kurds. And you said at the beginning that we're reminded. Of course, nobody's reminded more of what happened in the 90s when Kurds were fighting against other Kurds than the Kurds who were there. And very much, there's a lot of people saying we don't want a fratricidal war. There's been people coming in, Kurds from right across the world, trying to diffuse the situation, and particularly sort of groups of intellectuals and artists coming to speak to people. None of the other political parties, they're all trying to hold back what's happening. Yeah.
Mm. And it makes me think about, for example, in the general context, it's always impossible to separate the Kurdish issues, whether it's taking place in Iraq or in Syria or in Turkey. And we know that in Turkey right now, it's going through a lot of domestic tumult, whether it's from the economy or the Sedat Peker scandals, or just the growing dissatisfaction with President Erdogan's government. And in the background of all this, we have the case against the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, the HDP, that's going on right now. And amidst all this, at the same time, the main accusation, of course, always levied against the HDP is that they tried to connect them with the PKK, who, of course, they consider a terrorist organization. And then, in addition to that, too, we have in the background speeches made by Erdogan and others who are flirting at the idea of like a renewed attack inside of Iraq. They established more bases. The drone strikes have increased. They've developed their intelligence networks in the area, but they seem almost content with that strategy that you listed there also, where to have the Peshmerga forces of the KRG lock down the PKK in certain areas and then just kind of like slowly bleed them out at that point. They have close to 40 bases inside northern Iraq at this point, and the steady beat of drone strikes, bombings, etc., seems to be their preference right now over a prolonged, something like the Operation Peace Spring, the invasion of northern Syria back in October 2019. So do you think that it's more likely that we're going to see Turkey want to try to push in that direction of trying to replicate what they do in Syria, or that they're more content to just continue this sort of like remote pressure campaign instead on the PKK in the hopes of weakening them further?
Well, as you say, I think it's really, really important to see this as part of their attacks on the Kurds in all places that there are Kurds, and that they really see the Kurds as the biggest block to what they're trying to do both at home and abroad. So it's the Kurds that are the biggest campaigners for democracy and pluralism within Turkey. And Erdogan has made no secret of his ambitions, his neo-Ottoman dreams, if you like, of getting rid of the borders from the 1923 borders from the Treaty of Lausanne, and expanding right across, including Mosul, Kirkuk, Aleppo. So definitely, his ambitions are there to go way beyond just being bogged down in the mountains. I think after, on the previous campaigns, they've been sort of, look what we're doing. I think and then been rather taken aback when things have not gone as well. I mean, if you look at the campaign before this in Ankara, and things clearly did not go as they expected them to. So this time they've been rather more careful in what they've announced beforehand, so that people can't say, well, where is it? Where's the great success then? Mm-hmm. So I'm sure there are ambitions to go way beyond. And I think there are a lot of parallels in what they're doing to what they've done in other places. So, for example, in bringing in the mercenary Islamist militias, which they've brought in on the ground, and the sort of the way they've destroyed everything in their path, really, the massive environmental destruction and making it impossible for the local people there, just really clearing the path. It's very much an occupation, and it's very much an intending to stay. Clearly, I mean, this is something that's gone on for a long time. They've been increasing their role, their footprint on the ground in South Kurdistan. But it does seem to have an extra intensity, I think, at the moment. And as you were saying, I think, partly this is driven by troubles at home. So, the classic thing, you've got troubles at home, so you turn outwards and you try and produce results outside, and to get people to come together in a nationalist turning outwards, rather than focusing on the troubles at home and on their falling support at home.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about the international dimension in this case too? Because you mentioned the Gara operation, And around that time, we remember a mix of reactions across the board. Of course, we had the United States has generally been supportive of Turkey its pursuit of its what it considers its legitimate security interests when it conducts operations against the PKK. Yes, and then at the same time, the statement that came out after the Gari operation, I remember when I reported on it, almost instantly, Turkey was clearly paying attention to it, because almost instantly they criticized the statement as inadequate, and it pushed the U.S. to revise it equally fast. But then, of course, we had the big kerfuffle, to lack of a better term, between Turkey and Iran during that time, because Iran, they accused Turkey of wanting to extend their security corridor across northern Iraq, that they didn't want them there. And then Turkey basically said that Iran's in no position to lecture them on anything related to interference. So, all of that being said, I don't think that the international picture has really changed that dramatically on where each of these kind of players stand on this region. But do you think that there's any fear that they don't want to overplay their hand, that Turkey will stick to this set of remote operations, lest it out of antagonize Iran, who's well positioned, of course, throughout that area, and could destabilize the KRG, or in turn even risk overplaying its position with the US if it means creating a doorway to more Iranian involvement in what's still considered one of the only stable parts of Iraq?
I think the role of all the imperial powers is the bit that's really not properly discussed at all. And with, I think, the United States being the biggest elephant in the room, really. But of course, they're not the only ones. You've also got Russian involvement there. As you say, you've got the more local powers, Iran and Turkey. And yes, the United States has made it very clear that they absolutely support getting rid of the PKK. And, they even to the renewing the bounty that they put on the heads of the 3 PKK leaders. And similarly, actually, their intervention in Sinjar, in Shengal, and the agreement that the United States has brokered there for the area to really be controlled by the Iranian, the mixture of the Iranian government and the KDP, and without taking cognizance of what people who actually live there actually want. So, and the fact that those were the 2 forces that basically ran away and left them to ISIS. So, the American intervention is huge, and NATO more generally, actually, of course, and we've got a lot of European powers as well working closely with the KRG. And I think it's, from their perspective, Turkey is important strategically, clearly is a really important power that they want to keep on NATO's side. And Turkey, of course, is quite good at, it's playing a really tricky game in balancing this with the Russians as well, and trying to play one off against the other. But the other thing from the NATO perspective is they really don't want to see a guerrilla force succeed against a NATO army. That would, that would set a very dangerous precedent from their point of view, wouldn't it? So, the NATO is very much supporting Turkey.
Well, on that point about the success of a guerrilla force against a standing NATO army, it makes me think about the other main regional player that needs to be brought up naturally, and that's the KRG. And if we take the KRG's statements and actions of the recent years as anything, they have their own set of gripes with the PKK, whether it's ideological or because other tensions, like the attacks between the skirmishes between peshmerga and PKK militants. Barzani accuses the PKK of infringing on the KRG by collecting their own taxes and recruiting child soldiers into their ranks. And then, of course, the PKK has taken responsibility for attacks against pipelines from the KRG that go to Turkey and then onwards to Europe. So from their perspective, it's as if the PKK is attacking their lifeblood in some cases. But do you think that considering this long and also complicated history between the KRG and the PKK, it is fair to say that they also just don't really want to see the PKK on its land, and the KRG has done a very concerted amount of effort to really just build its relationship with these same Western powers, like whether it's the United States or European countries, to position themselves as sort of like island of stability, at least in a tumultuous area, and that the PKK is a threat to that.
It's a little sad if that stability, because it's not really very stable, and it's a very, I mean, obviously they've got their own troubles to seek, because their own problems with the corruption and the unpaid salaries and the major protests and which have been put down very violently. So there's a lot of problems within the KRG as well. I mean, obviously, that it's completely hypocritical, because if you go right back to the early 80s, they were also freedom fighters and actually welcoming the PKK into that bit of land, and it's for their own self-interest that they now don't find it convenient having them there, but actually, I mean, for their self-interest, not for the interest of Kurdistan more generally, because I don't believe that the attacks that we're seeing are just about attacking the PKK. I think that that Turkey has its eyes on that land, and they don't want to see genuine Kurdish power and Kurdish independence. I mean, maybe friendly the KDP that's so tightly bound to them now economically. I mean, through their oil deals, through all their other deals, they very much can't afford not to do what Turkey wants. So maybe they're okay, but actually, as far as Turkey is concerned, but actually they don't want to see a genuinely independent Kurdish region, or autonomous Kurdish region there. So yes, it's very much, I think, we're looking at very self-interested and of course very feudal politics with the KDP. And it's not the first time that we've seen that America and other NATO powers are really quite happy to work with authoritarian governments if that suits them all, it does what they want on the ground.
Mm-hmm. And I've had conversations on the Kurdish question with a number of times with a few experts here on Turkey Abroad, and one claim that I think is important to also bring up here is that what this expert told me was that the mistake of U.S. foreign policy in particular when it comes to dealing with the Kurdish question in the Middle East is that they treat it as like individual problems, like whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Iraq, and whether it's in Turkey, they're all separate. When in reality, the Kurdish situation has to be addressed almost as a whole, and then that naturally steps on some toes, because we remember 2017 when the Iraqi government put down the independence referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan. Bashar al-Assad is no friend of the Kurds. Turkey, self-explanatory, and then Iran, whatever kind of interest they get from working with any Kurdish groups in Iraq, it's an extension of their overall project within the country. So, that being said, it does seem that, of course, it just brings to my mind the interesting sort of interaction between these international dynamics, as we mentioned, like NATO, the United States, so on, and who they align with, like say in Turkey's case, or the KRG. But then the regional countries themselves also just don't seem to, they don't seem like they're going to move anytime soon in this direction of accepting what, as you mentioned, like Kurdish independence, if that was the end goal. These countries themselves, they're going to pull out every stop to really prevent that, as we already saw in Iraq's case and in Turkey's case. So it seems to me that just regionally, none of the other countries really want to see that happen either.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, well, certainly all the groups that follow Öcalan's ideas make it very clear that they're not actually talking about independence, but that they are talking about being able to follow their own culture and people to be able to be Kurdish or whatever group they belong to, and for more autonomy generally for everybody. Yes, I think you're absolutely right that people aren't looking enough at the overall picture. The Kurds are, but international forces are. And of course, one of the things that they're not looking at in the overall picture is what happens to the general security of the area, what happens to the so-called, the fight against ISIS and the fight against that sort of terrorism that they're supposed to be all signed up to. And the Kurds have long talked about this as a third world war, and I think there's a very good reason for calling it that, because really it is a fight against authoritarian fascist type powers, and in this instance, the powers that would like to see themselves as anti-fascist, the United States, the European powers, are not on that side, and they are enabling these very authoritarian regimes, but they're also enabling an enormous instability that will allow room for a regrowth of, if not ISIS, things similar to, ISIS is still, there's a lot of pockets of ISIS and bits still happening. The fight against ISIS is still very much ongoing. And it's absolutely terrifying, I think, seeing what's happening wherever Turkey is getting a foothold and invading and occupying, and the way they're carrying out this ethnic cleansing and bringing in these jihadi groups. It's so destabilizing, and it's creating, it can create instability for literally centuries ahead, these sort of movements. It's terrifying. Obviously, being British, my immediate thought goes to Ireland and how, what happened just with the settlements in Ireland and bringing people into Ireland is still causing, major divisions and today. And this is happening on a much bigger scale.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know it as well as I do that Kurdish politics and affairs have this tendency of very quickly being swept under the rug and overlooked by many in the West, or in general. And when it comes to talking about like international politics, and that always seems, at least in the recent decades, to come back and haunt everyone in some way, shape, or form, whether it's during the Iraq War or during the fight against ISIS. Inevitably, say like in the United States' case, it ends up returning and trying to find some workaround with the Kurds, and creates that precarious balancing act between itself and Turkey, if we can call it that. And it made me think there was a point in your article that you also listed where you point out that when President Joe Biden met with Erdogan last month at the NATO summit, it was notable for what wasn't said about Turkish actions, at the time. And, like I mentioned, the United States has generally supported Turkey against the PKK, and, they have their own, they're still locked into the strategy in Iraq where, the main goals is the fight against ISIS or, balancing Iran. But do you think that the West or the United States is making a mistake by continuing to really ignore the fact that this continuing set of tensions and clashes and animosity between, say, Turkey and the PKK could potentially spill over and create those problems that you mentioned, like whether it's a new ISIS or something else altogether?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if one just imagines the same amount of effort being put into actually trying to restart some sort of peace discussion as is put into all the war and the fighting. I mean, because I think this is the only solution that the only way this is going to diffuse is when there's actually a peaceful solution for the Kurds. And as I said, we're not talking about necessarily independence. We're talking about people being allowed to live their culture in dignity in the place where they live, which is kind of it's what so many of these powers claim to stand for. But actually, when it's coming to the crunch and it's going against their self-interest, they're not standing up for it, and they're not prioritizing this. And I know it's the politics, most people's politics is not defined by ethics, but actually it's politically short-sighted too, as I said, because it's going to create so many problems in the future. So yeah, I do think they need to do that, and I think that actually they need to seriously question the fact that the cleverest move, I guess, that Turkey's done is getting everybody to call the PKK terrorists, and then by extension lots of other groups as well. So the whole thing becomes taboo and you can't actually engage with it. And I think this, it has been questioned. It's been questioned in the Belgian courts, successfully questioned in the Belgian courts, and argued that this is actually, they're freedom fighters, they're non-state actors fighting a war, and rather than terrorists. And this amorphous word terrorism is used to shut down the conversation, and the whole war against terrorism, of course, is used to justify all sorts of things, not just in this case. So it does need a stepping back and a reassessing and a looking at the bigger picture and at the longer picture, at the long-term interests, rather than the very, very short term that everything seems to be going on at the moment.
I imagine that a response to that, because as you mentioned, the term terrorist is very amorphous and creates its own hurdles. We see that, for example, in the U.S. policy in Syria, where obviously the YPJ, SDF forces, they're essentially an extension of the PKK in many ways. Like whether they have, they believe in some of, or at least they're followers of Öcalan's ideology, and a number of their cadres were from the PKK. Turkey loves to point out that General Mazlum Abdi was a PKK operative himself, and the U.S. has gone through these these verbal gymnastics to say they were PKK, but they're not PKK, but they're kind of you know what I'm talking about there. And it's only had the problem of exasperating relations with Turkey, while at the same time also creating complications inside, say, Syria or inside of Iraq. But at the same time, I get one response that would come to my mind is that, as you point out the Belgian case, but the United States, Turkey, and the European Union, they still regard the PKK as a foreign terrorist organization, and we've had international reports that cite things like, in some cases they say like drug trafficking or in recruiting child soldiers, so on. And the KRG, they when they clash with the PKK, they point out the attacks on like pipelines or fighting with the peshmerga, etc. But would that mean that if they were to change the paradigm, the PKK on the PKK's part, they'd have to swear off violence, though, is what I imagine the response would be.
Well, that would be to see. I mean, I don't see why they.
It's like the counter argument is.
I mean, they're trying to defend. They couldn't exactly defend South Kurdistan without fighting back. I mean, they are always very clear that what they're doing is defense. They can't defend themselves with their hands tied behind their back. So I'm sure they wouldn't do that. But I think, I think one has to be, of course, the KRG will try and, or anybody who's trying to, who sees them as an opposition, it's always the child soldiers or whatever. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who are underage that have gone to the mountains. Whether they're actually fighting is probably another matter. This is brought up, but what isn't brought up is the many accusations that we've had about chemical weapons being used by Turkey, both against the PKK in the mountains now, and then earlier in Syria. And these really serious accusations are not followed up by international organizations. So there's always a very asymmetric look at these things, depending on who people support, I think.
Mm-hmm. And there's the one last question I'd also like to put to you, and it comes back to your article. And at the end of it, you said that the solution is actually quite simple, namely a return to the peace negotiations that were ongoing between Turkey and the PKK that were ultimately scuttled in 2015 when Erdogan took that sharp turn to the the Islamist nationalist right, and we had the situation going on in Syria and Kobani and the protests and fallout that followed all of that. But what would a road to returning to these negotiations look like at this point, especially when Erdogan and his ultra-nationalist allies, like say in the MHP, they seem to be doubling down on using say the HDP case or campaigns against the PKK to really galvanize what they have their base to survive. And then at this point, it seems like there wouldn't really be able to have a successful set of peace negotiations if it wasn't to include what goes on inside of Iraq right now, because in the previous negotiations, if I remember correctly, the PKK had withdrawn into Iraq from Turkey as part of them. And now the whole campaign is focused on Iraq. And I guess that would mean, out of finding some way to reconcile the PKK and the KDP or disarm, whatever that might be, it just seems to me that a lot of the roads that were initially traveled to reach peace negotiations between the two sides have burned at this point. What do you think?
Well, the PKK has certainly made it clear that they would, serious peace negotiations is what they would really like. I think, when things in Turkey are so unstable, I think that, we shouldn't be looking at this is going to be the state of the Turkish government forever. And a lot hangs on the nature of opposition and resistance within Turkey. And, if the other opposition parties actually do become opposition parties in action rather than name, and do actually push for more democracy. So I don't think we need to, give up hope. And I think that I'm just astonished by the levels of resistance. And there's resistance to the Turkish government in so many different areas. And I think if those can come together, the resistance against the ending of the Istanbul Convention, the resistance by the students of the imposition of a government-controlled rector, there's a lot of resistance there, and we can see that the Turkish government support is falling, which is, of course, there's something very dangerous about a power that's losing power, and they're sort of lashing out and desperately trying. It's actually made them more aggressive. But also, I don't think. You were seeing the actions now in Iraq, but it could have been in Syria. And I think, there's still a lot of action in Syria. There's still a lot of pressure on Syria. For example, cutting off the water to Syria is a major, massively reducing the amount of water that comes in through the Euphrates, which Turkey is doing, basically trying to starve people out, which is a massive war crime. And that's something that needs to be taken up by international powers. So the action isn't just in Iraq. It's and as you say, it's against the HDP. It's happening everywhere. So I mean, Turkey is, the Turkish government is under pressure, and they're acting and lashing out in all these directions. But there is a strong resistance, and if that resistance can come together, if it can be supported, by people outside. I mean, if more information gets out there, so that our governments in the States, in Europe, can't just ignore what's happening. I don't think we have to give up that it's going to be autocratic and there's no hope. And I don't think we can afford to, even just utterly selfishly, because it's a really, really dangerous situation for everybody. It's creating so much instability. It's making a really, really dangerous place for the rest of the world.
Sarah, I would like to thank you again for taking the time to join me today on Turkey Abroad. But we've reached the end of the recording at this point. So again, thank you for taking the time to join me today. And I look forward to getting into trade views with you again sometime soon.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
My name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.